So, Dr. Sean Duffy is Professor of Political Science and Executive Director of the Albert Schweitzer Institute at Quinnipiac University. An international relations theorist by training, Sean now teaches courses on US foreign policy, global political economy, and environmental politics and policy. Before beginning his doctoral program, he worked for 3 years as an information analyst at the US Agency for International Development in Washington, D.C.
I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference, Max and Ben. This is pulling together very nicely, and the flow of the afternoon has been very nice, and I'm very happy to be following Augustin, because he's taken some of the pressure off of me. You said you're not an expert on Schweitzer, and I'm not either. But it's been very enjoyable for me to have listened to all of you who have presented before, and I've gotten little nuggets of ideas to bring into our work, which is what I'd like to talk a little bit about today. So at the Albert Schweitzer Institute at Quinnipiac University in Hamden, Connecticut, where I am, we've been guided by Schweitzer's legacy by developing programs that bring students into direct experiential relationship to community work in 3 areas defined nearly 20 years ago when the Institute joined Quinnipiac University on a permanent basis: peace and human rights, healthcare and human development in poorly served communities, and care for the environment. As we claim on our website, we, quote, conduct programs that link education, ethics, and volunteerism for the sake of creating a more peaceful and sustainable world. So you could say that our mission is really trying to keep in action Schweitzer's example and his ethics. While we're guided very generally by a sense of Schweitzer's legacy and his ethic of reverence for life, I welcome this conference then as an opportunity to step back to reflect and to work more intentionally to ground our work in Schweitzer's thought more concretely. And so these comments represent in equal parts a report on what we're doing and an initial attempt to connect these actions to Schweitzer's academic legacy. I assumed the director of ASI nearly 2 years ago. At that time, or at the time that I took up the reins, the Institute had established itself programmatically on campus by, quote, bringing the world to Quinnipiac and Quinnipiac to the world, in the words of one of my colleagues who's been involved with the Schweitzer Institute during all those years that it's been on our campus. My predecessor had made connections with the permanent secretariat for the World Summits of Nobel Peace Laureates and had been bringing laureates to campus and Quinnipiac students to the summits since 2005. He had also interpreted Schweitzer's legacy of reverence for and service to others by bringing, over the period of roughly a decade, over 350 students to community-engaged volunteerism in Central America. I traveled with ASI trips myself to Nicaragua and Guatemala as my first introduction to the work of the Institute. So when I assumed the directorship, our work overseas in the area of peace and human rights and human health and development was well established, but a number of factors urged me to start working in another direction. And I can talk about those factors later if there's interest. And so we've begun to focus our interpretation of Schweitzer's legacy by focusing on today's environmental and ecological challenges. And those were some of the points where my ears perked up this morning at this morning's papers, when some of you were talking about whether, or raising the question of whether we really could extend Schweitzer's legacy to climate change, for example. And I think that's something that I've been very much struggling with myself, and of course I'm answering in the affirmative. So in the time I have remaining to me, I'd like to trace out the direction we've taken in this endeavor. I'd like to suggest that reverence for life and Schweitzer's own example in the years after his Nobel Prize naturally lead us to focus on the dual environmental crises that confront all life on Earth: climate change and the already underway great wave of extinction that threatens biological diversity on our planet. This, combined with Schweitzer's example and the related implication that each of us can find our own Lamborghini, near or far, has led us to a focus on food. So on Schweitzer's reverence for life and threats to humanity, in a letter to President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1957, quoted in Harold Robles's Reverence for Life, the Works of Albert Schweitzer, that came out in 1993, Schweitzer exhorted, "May it be given to us both to see the day when the world's people will realize that the fate of all humanity is now at stake, and that it is urgently necessary to make the bold decisions that can deal adequately with the agonizing situation in which the world now finds itself." The fact that he said this some 60 years ago does not diminish its timeliness today. More specifically, with respect to the issues of that day, Schweitzer said in a 1961 letter to Norman Cousins, also quoted in Robles's book, "My hope is that by the gravity of the situation created by the resumption of nuclear tests, men throughout the world will understand that they must arrive at a solution to the problem of the terrible danger in which humanity is placed. They can no longer let things go, as they have been doing. We must understand that we are risking the terrible catastrophe in which humanity will perish." I've read enough about the efforts of many, before Cousins met with some success, who urged Schweitzer to speak out about nuclear weapons, to know that Schweitzer was reluctant to take a position in the global spotlight on this or any other issue. So I cannot claim, as I once did, that if Schweitzer were alive today, he would be leading the charge on climate change. But I can surmise with a fair amount of confidence that Schweitzer's words on the nuclear threat to life, in the context of his ethical maxim of reverence for life, that this can be easily applied to the environmental threats that confront us today. This idea isn't even unique or isn't novel at this time either. The Albert Schweitzer Institute for the Humanities, the earlier manifestation of the institute I represent today, held a 2-day conference at the UN on the relevance of Albert Schweitzer at the dawn of the 20th century back in August of 1990. The proceedings were later published in a volume edited by David Miller and James Puyard. In the moderator's introduction to the session on ecology and the environment, Jackson Lee Ice stated, "In our first session, we heard about arms reduction, the nuclear threat, and the problems of possible extinction of the human race. I call that the quick bomb. But there is another bomb, a slow bomb, that is just as destructive and just as deadly. Perhaps T.S. Eliot's prognostication is correct, that the world will end not with a bang, but with a whimper. The bomb that threatens us, that's slowly going off as we sit here, is our environmental crisis. I feel as if I'm a citizen of a small town," he said, "that's threatened by an oncoming flood, and that the way we are meeting this threat is by fixing a few leaking faucets in a few homes. I hope we can do more, and that we might begin by listening to our speaker's attempt to make Albert Schweitzer's idea relevant to this very important and very serious problem of our environment and ecology." Schweitzer himself said in his Declaration of Conscience, "What we seem to forget is that, yes, the sun will continue to rise and set, and the moon will continue to move across the skies, but mankind can create a situation in which the sun and moon can look down upon an earth that has been stripped of all life." This is a sympathy that I've heard repeated in different formulations across about the potential effects of the current ecological crisis that confronts us. The past 12 months have been, in fact, quite notable for the public attention that has finally been drawn to these threats on the world stage, and the 3-part report issued by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, over the last year has helped to bring clarity to the nature of the challenge. The special report on global warming that came out a little over a year ago, on October 8th in 2018, spectacularly put a time frame on things. We have a very slight chance of containing global warming to 1.5 degree increase on pre-industrial levels if we act in the next, now, 11 years. In August, the IPCC issued its report on climate change and land use, and last month the IPCC issued its report on the oceans and cryosphere and a changing climate. It's the second report on land use that is relevant to my topic today. Land use, particularly agriculture, is a major producer of greenhouse gas emissions. Furthermore, the way we produce and distribute food leads to a major paradox. In a world of plenty, we cannot seem to solve for the problem of hunger. According to the IPCC report on climate change and land, human use affects more than 70% of our global ice-free land surface, leading to the loss of natural ecosystems, which in turn leads to the loss of the ability to moderate the effects of climate change. This has also been driving biodiversity loss, and land use also plays an important part in the climate system more generally. Land is both a sink and a source of greenhouse gases in the soil, biomass, etc. The report also mentions that agriculture accounts for roughly 70% of fresh water use, and that currently, globally, 25 to 30% of the food that is produced is wasted, leading to additional greenhouse gas emissions. This at a time when 2 billion people worldwide are overweight or obese, and an estimated 821 million are still undernourished. If we take into account food insecurity, this number gets much larger than that of those who are struggling with food hardship. In the United States, to bring this to where I work on a college campus and make it relevant to American students, the amount of food that is produced and wasted is much higher, some 35 to 40%. And food produced in the US has a very high carbon footprint. It travels long distances. It's produced with adverse effects on the climate and biodiversity loss because it's land extensive. It leads to the destruction of a lot of ecosystems and ecosystem services, including the sequestration of carbon in grass and forest systems. It's chemically intensive, leading to more use of petrochemicals. And the fact that it is largely focused on monoculture production means that it's implicit in biodiversity loss and soil degradation that in turn then require more chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And the fact that it's focused on an annual crop system rather than perennial crop and the heavy tillage practices associated with that, this accelerates the transfer of carbon from the soil, which is a sink, a natural sink, to the atmosphere. We also suffer in the United States from rates of between 20 and 40% or higher of food insecurity in our communities. And sometimes this is, ironically, the highest among populations in the food economy, farmers, food service workers, etc. So just parenthetically, I've been using the term food security, food insecurity. We can describe a household or a community as food secure when it has regular access to sufficient quantities of healthy, affordable, and culturally appropriate food. So I'm not talking simply about hunger or the lack of calories. I'm talking about the lack of regular access to healthy, affordable, and culturally appropriate food. So what can we do about this locally? So I've been serving since March 2018 on the Hamden Food Security Task Force. Hamden is the town in which we're located, which was convened by the United Way, which is an organization, a nonprofit organization that combines charity or money raising with social programs. And our first objective has been to identify, measure, and as best we can, evaluate hunger in our local community. So the task force was initially comprised of interested professionals and practitioners in our community and has since expanded. But notably, it includes the leaders of our public school system, teachers, social workers, and administrators. It has included community representatives, particularly from the faith community, town officials, and our food bank, our sort of emergency food backup system, and some other academics and institutions and public health workers. The Hunger Report, which came out just last April, focusing on Hamden, details that the changing demographics of suburban areas in the United States, our own community included. Some of these changing demographics mean that there are more immigrants and racial minorities in our suburban communities. And in Hamden, we're notable for having a very large senior population. More than 50% of the residents are over the age of 70. Increasing levels of income insecurity that come from the rise in low-wage jobs in the suburbs. For example, between 2000 and 2011, the number of poor residents in suburban U.S. communities grew by 64%. And demographic factors such as the distance between affordable housing, which is dropping or declining in its prevalence, and jobs is also increasing. And cuts to government programs at both the federal and state levels mean that the safety net is much thinner and less substantial than it once was. The report also details a rise in income inequality and the inequality in income growth. particularly in our state of Connecticut, which has one of the largest differentials between the extremely wealthy and a majority of very poor population. To give another example here, coming from Connecticut, in 2018, our federal government defined poverty for a house of four as being those earning under just over $25,000 a year. Many of our federal programs and state programs are indexed to this poverty rate at about 130%, which means that families of four, households of four, that have an income of under about $32,000 can apply for these programs. However, what we've looked at in our own communities is a striking gap that has become defined as ALICE households. So ALICE is an acronym. It's the woman's name, Alice, for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. So these are households that have all adults working, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs, but still cannot make ends meet. And we define these households as those that largely lie between that federal poverty line and the cost of living, which is defined by a combination of looking at costs of housing, food, childcare, healthcare, transportation, taxes, and other necessities. So if you remember that number, the federal poverty level at $25,000 a year, in my state of Connecticut, the cost of living is defined for a family of four at over $92,000. So the families that earn between $25,000 and $92,000 are the ones who regularly have to make a decision as to whether to buy food or pay the rent. If they have unexpected healthcare costs, they have to then forego something else, maybe transportation, maybe childcare, or if they can't afford childcare, they can't make it to work and lose their jobs. So they're really very difficult trade-offs that these families are dealing with, and often it's the regular access to high-quality food that suffers. So the estimated statistics then that we come to for our community for food hardship in Hamden, combining those who live under the poverty level and those who fall into this ALICE category, is 39% of the population, nearly 40%. So this task force has proceeded to advance a number of initiatives: school lunches, summer meals, mobile food pantries, outreach campaigns, dollar dinners at local churches, etc. For our part, at the Albert Schweitzer Institute, we've begun to engage students with the initiative in a number of ways. So one of these ways is by getting students engaged with food rescue or food recovery on campus. So 3 days a week over the last academic year, we had student volunteers and student organizations working to recover extra food from our dining halls and bring them to different agencies in Hamden that could serve the food that very day to clients or children participating in after-school programs that are at high risk for food hardship in their families and communities. We're in the process of integrating these efforts more fully with community efforts this year in a way that will be sustained going forward and won't require us starting anew with each academic year. We're also quite pleased that the Albert Schweitzer Institute will be entering into an agreement with our local community center to manage a community garden. And this garden will grow fresh produce for the food bank at the center. It will hopefully it could begin to build bridges between Quinnipiac students and the community by making the garden a place where all people can come to engage with the earth, with the sources of their food, and with knowledge. They can share knowledge related to healthy food systems. And they also conduct after-school programs for children at this community center. So managing a garden there gives us an opportunity to work with children around learning skills with growing and preparing food. These are just 3 ways that we see the potential for sustained and multifaceted engagement between the university and local communities through Schweitzer Institute programs. Now, coming full circle then, something that's occurred to us over the last year. It's not a new occurrence, but these activities give us a new lens on defining a problem that is much more difficult for a high-priced university to confront today. Quinnipiac is a fairly high-priced education. That's the food hardship experienced by our own students. So at Quinnipiac, the student meal plan requires a contribution of $1,885 a semester, which yields about $126 of credit a week to spend in our dining halls. That's about $18 a day. I often will eat lunch in our dining halls and pay $9 for a salad or $9 for a bowl of soup. So you can see I've already used up half of my daily allowance if I'm on the meal plan. We're also a fairly isolated campus. A student really needs access to an automobile to access alternatives to the dining halls on campus, or even to make it to a grocery store. Growing indebtedness, or the growing indebtedness of students and their families, often means that students and their families have not budgeted for, nor can they provide supplementary funds to augment what is being billed as what is sufficient for food security on campus. So to conclude, what we're learning, or what I'm learning these first few years in my directorship of the Albert Schweitzer Institute, is that there are ample ways to make Schweitzer's legacy relevant to a new generation of students and to the social, political, economic, and environmental issues that confront us today. And that these issues are closely entwined. We can start talking about the environment and end up talking about food security and income inequality. Schweitzer helps us to make these connections. Schweitzer stated in his philosophy of civilization, "Ethics demands that every one of us, in some way and with some object, shall be a human being for human beings." I'm thinking of what you said, Augustin. It says to them, find for yourself some secondary activity, inconspicuous, perhaps even secret. Open your eyes and look for a human being, or some work devoted to human welfare which needs from someone a little time or friendliness, a little sympathy, or sociability or labor, and be prepared for disappointments. But in any case, do not be without some secondary work in which you give yourself as person to person. But to everyone, in whatever state of life he finds himself, and I think this potentially plays well to our student population, he said, the ethics of reverence for life do this. They force him without cessation to be concerned at heart with all the human destinies and all other life destinies which are going through their life course around him, and to live himself as man to the man who needs a fellow man. They will not allow the scholar to live only for his learning, even if his learning makes him very useful, nor the artist to live only for his art, even if by means of it he gives something to many. They do not allow the very busy man to think that with his professional duties he has fulfilled every demand upon him. They demand from all that they devote a portion of their lives to their fellows. I'm also finding that Schweitzer's enduringly optimistic orientation to the Western philosophical tradition helps in another way as well. In the face of daunting existential challenges, Schweitzer offers us hope and a way forward. Robles included in his Reverence for Life the words of Albert Schweitzer, a letter to a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy that Schweitzer wrote in 1952. And he said in this letter, "I believe that there is reason for hope. Hope is there like a small band of light on the sky before the sunrise. There begins to stir in the world a new spirit, a spirit of humanity. The terrible thing was that we fell into humanity without knowing it. And because the new spirit begins to stir, there is hope, for the spirit is the great transforming power." So this can actually affect what we do teach and what we do in the face of seemingly impossible existential crises. That small actions, even those taken at a personal level, can matter, and that we can see the connections between these actions and the larger things afoot in the world. And these actually, Schweitzer helps us to believe that change is possible, that we do live in a life-affirming civilization-affirming civilization. So Schweitzer's ideas, although formed in a different era and shaped by the crises of civilization identifiable at his time, are surprisingly relevant to our times today. Even his lessons for the possibility of human hope and progress in the face of imperfect human institutions. In response to questions about the hope for the future, in an interview with Melvin Arnold in Lambaréné in 1947, Schweitzer states, "There is this one hope. We must return to the main road from which we have wandered. We must substitute the power of understanding the truth that is really true for propaganda. a noble kind of patriotism which aims at ends that are worthy of the whole of mankind for the patriotism current today, a humanity with a common civilization for idolized nationalisms, a restored faith in the civilized state for a society which lacks true idealism, a unifying ideal of civilized man for the condition into which we have plunged, a concern with the processes and ideals of true civilization for a preoccupation with the transient problems of living, a faith in the possibility of progress for a mentality stripped of all true spirituality. My conviction has not changed. These tasks are our tasks today. Thank you.